Now, our story begins a little bit further afield in the wilds of Hollinwood in Oldham, so just down from Moston there. Hannah Beswick was born in 1688 in Hollinwood, and her dad was John Beswick of Failsworth, who left Hannah quite a substantial amount of money in his will. And some years before Hannah died, because this story does kind of begin with Hannah Beswick's death in 1758, she had a brother called John who had been proclaimed dead a few years before she died. And the family had organised a funeral, and as the coffin lid was being lowered on John Beswick, the junior, Hannah's brother, she noticed her brother's eyelids begin to flicker just as the coffin lid was being closed. So she screamed, and there was a big uproar, and the coffin was not buried. It was opened up, a doctor was called, and sure enough, it turned out John was still alive. He had been almost prematurely buried. And this experience gave Hannah an absolute, as it would, terrifying fear of being buried alive. So when she died, she left instructions for her doctor, a man called Dr. Charles White, that she was to be kept above ground. Her body was to be kept above ground for a long enough time that it could be absolutely certain that she was dead. She did not want to be buried straight away, and indeed she was not buried straight away. So Dr. Charles White, who was just as eccentric as Hannah Beswick, had this set of instructions that he was to keep his patient's body above ground and to periodically check it for signs of life as well. He had to keep checking it. Decided that if he was going to keep this body, as he'd been instructed, he would embalm it. He would embalm Hannah Beswick's body, and he would do it probably, we're not totally sure how Dr. White embalmed Hannah Beswick's body, but he probably did it by replacing all her blood with a mixture of turpentine and vermilion. And then he put the body in an old clock case, stored it in his house, and allowed people to come into his house and view it, as so he becomes something of a celebrity. And the body, which became known as the Manchester Mummy, or the Mummy of Birchen Bower, because Birchen Bower was the house in Hollinwood that Hannah Beswick had, was became a sort of I guess a kind of tourist attraction in the local area. Eventually, after Dr. White's death, the mummified body was bequeathed to the Museum of Manchester Natural History. Now, no pictures of the Manchester Mummy or the Mummy of Birchen Bower exist, but there is a description from this is from Philip Wentworth, who's a local historian, a description of the body after it was transferred to the museum. The body was well preserved, but the face was shriveled and black. The legs and trunks were tightly bound in a strong cloth, and the body, which was that of a little old woman, was in a glass coffin-shaped case. Now, this was a very, very popular attraction. It was described as one of the most remarkable objects in the museum, and Edith Sitwell, the writer, described it thus, said that the cold, dark shadow of her mummy hung over Manchester in the middle of the 18th century. Now, eventually, the collection of the Museum of the Manchester Natural History Society was bought by the University of Manchester, and eventually the University of Manchester decided that it was not appropriate and it wasn't popular to continue displaying the mummified body of Hannah Beswick. And so they decided in 1868, 110 years after Dr. White had embalmed her, that the body of Hannah Beswick should be buried. Now, in those 110 years, there had been numerous stories about the ghost of Hannah Beswick in Hollinwood, and stories about hidden gold and all sorts of hauntings that had gone on at Birchen Bower. Birchen Bower became the Ferranti factory in Hollinwood in the 80s. I'm going to leave those ghost stories to one side. You can find them quite easily and tell you what happened next, which was that the University of Manchester decided to bury Hannah Beswick on the 22nd of July 1868 in Manchester General Cemetery, which any locals will know is also known as Harper Hay Cemetery and is just across Rochdale Road from the Manchester Communications Academy where I sit now. And that was the final resting place of the body of Hannah Beswick. The grave is unmarked, but people tell that there's some trees towards sort of halfway down the cemetery, towards the side. There were some trees there. And if you just, on a dark night, maybe a Halloween night, if you go to where those trees are and listen very, very carefully, people have reported hearing some noises coming from below the ground. And 2 visitors to the cemetery told a very particular tale where one night, as they were walking back through, they distinctly heard the sound of scratching coming from underneath the ground. And as they leant in closer, they just heard a voice say, "I'm not dead yet."